It was a quiet Monday in Duncan, Oklahoma. The kind of small town where you can hear sprinklers ticking across perfect lawns and the school bells carry on the wind. Inside a handsome red brick home, the scene did not match the calm. 3 members of the Hruby family were dead. The phone calls began, first to check on a missed meeting, then to ask why the paper's publisher had not answered overnight messages, and finally to call the police. What investigators found that morning had shattered the town's sense of safety and pulled the mask off a life that had looked comfortable from the curb. By sundown, attention had turned to the one person not found inside the house, the older child of the family, 19-year-old Alan. From a distance, the Hrubys looked like a portrait in a local feature story. John ran the Marlow Review, a small but well-regarded weekly paper that served the area north of Duncan. He was steady, organized, proud of his work, and proud of his family. His wife, known to his friends and neighbors as Tinker, was warm and social, the kind of person who remembered people's kids and their birthdays. Their daughter, known to friends as Kay, was a high school senior. She posted pictures with friends, planned for prom, talked about colleges. They were not wealthy in a movie sense, but they were secure. They had a respected last name and a front porch where neighbors waved without thinking twice. It was not the kind of house anyone expected to be marked with police tape. Alan grew up in that same house and learned early that perception has power. He liked the look of success. New shoes mattered. The right watch mattered. The pose in a photo mattered. Teachers and friends remembered a kid who wanted to be seen in a certain way. He was not a star athlete or the student who stays late to lead a club. He was the student who understood the effect of a brand name on a shirt and a snapshot of a weekend in Dallas. That desire to be seen and to be admired did not stay a teenage quirk. It hardened into a habit. At his home, parents were patient for a long time. They paid for what they could and tried to draw the lines when spending turned into entitlement. Then the lines were crossed anyway. In high school, and again not long after, there were problems with money that was not his. One episode involved a credit card that belonged to a relative. Charges piled up. When the story got out, it spread fast in a town where news has no reason to move slowly. The explanation he gave did not satisfy the people who needed to hear it. His parents decided that consequences were unavoidable. They tried accountability without cruelty. They were not vindictive. They hoped pressure and maturity would snap him into adulthood, that embarrassment would be a teacher. When he left for the University of Oklahoma, many hoped distance in college would give him better habits. It did not. The university gave him a bigger stage. Norman is not a small town, and campus life has its own economy of image. There are student apartments where rented luxury is more common than quiet thrift. There are weekends divided into pre-game photos and post-game stories, and the cost that gets hidden on a statement later. The university also had a social group where some students showed off the symbols of status that Alan had long fixated on. He wanted to look like he belonged. He spent to keep up. He used other people's money to do it. Friends remembered a student who talked big, traveled often, posted the pictures to keep the image in motion, and never seemed to show shame when the bill came due. The fall of 2014 closed in around him. Debts were getting tighter. The story about borrowed money had already reached more people than he knew. His parents, tired and hurt, had begun to push back harder. They were not cutting him off from love. They were cutting him off from a habit that was burning their family's reputation and their savings. He told classmates he would be going home for a break. He told someone close to him he would be collecting a bank card. He told others that things would be easier soon. These were not words of a son planning a heartfelt apology. These were a college student's hints that something he thought of as a plan had already been decided in his mind. He returned to Duncan that long weekend and walked into the front door of the house where he had grown up. The details of the morning inside that home are recorded plainly in investigative reports, not because there was a witness who'd lived, but because the scene and the later confession described the same sequence. He waited. He armed himself with the handgun that belonged to the household. He shot his mother in the kitchen. He shot his sister. He left the rooms as they were and waited for his father to return home at the end of the workday. When John came home, he was shot near the entry. The pattern was not random. It was a son who knew the rhythms of the people who had raised him. In the hours that followed, there was no 911 call. There was no breakdown or attempt to undo what he had done. Instead, he left the house, drove away, and re-entered campus life as if the family home had simply gone quiet. There was a weekend of football and parties in Dallas. There were check-ins with people who had no idea what had happened. There were purchases on a car that did not belong to him. The social media pages kept their shine while the house in Duncan became still. When the work week began and the publisher missed a routine task, the chain of concern started. Colleagues called. A friend of the family called. Eventually, officers did a welfare check. They walked into the house and found the bodies. The first officers on the scene did not need a complete forensic run to know that they were looking at a triple homicide. The weapon's caliber could be measured by shell casings and the wounds, but the technical language mattered less than the human shock of the discovery. Word spread through Duncan faster than the police could hold it back. People in the neighborhood remembered seeing a familiar car coming and going. Officers began to gather security footage from intersections and businesses on the main roads in town and out of town. The story pointed in one direction almost immediately. The son was not inside the house. Detectives contacted Alan. They already had cell phone data that placed him close to the home during the time frame that mattered. Cameras had captured a vehicle matching his at the right times. They had the bank records. They had the card use. He agreed to speak. In the interview room, he was polite at first, confident, eager to control the story. He tried to give an alibi that did not survive the first request for specifics. When pressed on the location data, the timing of cards, and the movements of his car, the calm began to crack. He shifted from denial to a version of admission that retained control by choice of wording. If he took responsibility, then he could still make it sound like a decision rather than a reality that caught him. The full admission followed. He described how he waited for the right moment inside the house. He described in short sentences how each person died. He offered a motive that was as cold as it sounded. He wanted money. He believed life would be easier if the people who were saying no to him were not in his way. He had told at least one peer before the fact that he would be wealthy if his parents were gone. According to investigators, he had looked into life insurance policies in the recent past and believed there would be an inheritance he could access. He was 19 years old and described the plan as if it were a way to tidy up debt. There was no defense left by the time the district attorney laid out the case. The confession was recorded. The physical evidence matched his own description. The timeline was clean. The gun belonged to the household. The motive was not mysterious, even if it was incomprehensible to anyone who has experienced love. The legal strategy narrowed to punishment. A trial would have replayed photographs and 911 recordings and autopsy summaries across a county that had just lost a small-town publisher, his wife, and a teenage girl. The outcome was predictable. The defense moved toward a plea. In 2015, in a Stephens County courtroom, he accepted responsibility for the 3 deaths and received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Courtroom observers remember how quiet the room was when the judge pronounced his sentence. There are cases where a courtroom buzzes with whispers or anger when the gavel falls. This was not one. People describe a heavy silence. There were no speeches from the defendant that day about remorse that rang true. There was no attempt to explain the unexplainable beyond the words he had already used. The survivors of the family's wider circle watched a 19-year-old accept the rest of his life inside a cell and then be led away. The years since have not changed the fundamental shape of the story. There were no late motions that uncovered an alternate narrative. There were no surprise witnesses. There were only the same facts that stood on the first day and the long echoes inside a small town where 3 funerals happened at once. The Marlowe Review changed hands. The home stopped being a home. Friends moved through the grief the way people do when they cannot make sense of the beginning and cannot change the end. In interviews given after the case, investigators described him in the same 2 words, again and again, polite and hollow. The psychology of this kind of crime is not solved by a single label. People want one word to make sense of a person who takes away an entire family branch in a single weekend. Narcissism explains the entitlement and the ability to use others as props. Antisocial traits explain the absence of natural empathy. But there is also something more basic in how he thought about himself and others. He understood image better than he understood responsibility. He believed status could be bought with someone else's card and worn as if it were a second skin. He believed consequences were negotiable if you kept your smile steady and the story straight. When reality refused to honor that belief, he tried to remove the reality rather than change the belief. The details that people still ask about are about the ones that expose how far from ordinary remorse he stood. After the shootings, he did not run into the night. He checked into a hotel. He saw a football weekend in Dallas. He kept up appearance that his life was still moving briskly forward. He put his own comfort above the humanity that he had erased. That is why the judge used language about coldness at the sentencing. It was not just the act. It was the indifference to the loss that followed. If there is a single scene that captures the gulf between a normal home and one investigators walked into, it is the kitchen. A kitchen is noise. It is clatter and small talk, and someone cutting fruit, and someone leaving a laptop open on the end of the table to check the weather. That kitchen was silent when officers arrived, and the silence has never left the way people in Duncan think about that house. There are streets where the memory of a single morning will outlast the building itself. This is one of those streets. There are viewers who will look for a childhood trauma that explains away the later crimes. This story resists that comfort. He had parents who had been patient far past the point where most people would be. He had a sister who loved her friends and lived an ordinary teenage life. He had a town that supported his father's work. He had every chance to change course and chose not to. This is not a story about being pushed into a corner by a cruel world. This is a story about a young man who wanted the rewards of adulthood without the work, who turned people into obstacles and then into targets when their love no longer included a blank check. This is Midnight Verdict Dark Minds. All facts, no fluff. Like, comment, and subscribe for more episodes that confront the psychology of real cases and respect the lives that were lost.